Okay, welcome to another episode of the Footwear Intern podcast. Today we've got Lenny with us. Super excited to hear a little bit about his journey in and around the footwear industry. Um, but if this is your first time listening to the Footwear Intern podcast, this is a podcast built, made, maintained to share stories of footwear professionals, their path into and throughout the footwear industry. So Lenny, super excited to have you on today and to get the opportunity to hear your story and share it with others. But yeah, I'd love a little intro on you and hear about your story and getting into the footwear space.
Well, it's a long story, and so I'll just tell the first beginning part. I started in the shoe industry when I was probably 14 or 15 years old as a stock boy at a local shoe company that my sister worked at. There were probably 14 stores at that time in San Diego. And so I was stocking shelves at big sales that they would have at outlet stores. And then I started working as a stock boy in one of their stores when I was probably 15. And then I started selling shoes when I was 16. And eventually I joined Nordstrom. I think I was 18 when I joined Nordstrom.
Cool. I also worked in a shoe store for a bit as well. So then, did you have a passion for shoes, or was it your sister was already there and it was just a good job, or?
Well, that young, I don't recall that I particularly had, and I was, it was terrible work, picking people's shoes off the floor and putting them back on racks and that kind of thing. But it certainly seemed like a good path to make pretty good money for a young person. And I can remember I was thinking about going into psychology and talking to I was selling shoes to a psychology doctor, and he said, "Well, that's a terrible job. I don't know if you really want to do that." So it, the reality of selling shoes, and I did go to school at night too while I was at Nordstrom's because I thought, at least to plan for something different in the future. But I've always enjoyed the footwear industry. The fashion side of it was the first thing that, as I worked in the ladies' footwear area, we had to be aware of what was going on in fashion. And I was a manager, so I had people reporting to me, and I had to manage the team and set up the displays and do all that kind of thing. So
That's cool. So you transferred over to Nordstrom. How long were you there?
about 4 years, and then I was selling shoes to a guy who would come in regularly who was running an importing business in the United States. And he would come and ask me questions like, is this shoe selling? Is that shoe selling? So show me the shoes that are selling. He hired a friend of mine whose father was a buyer for JCPenney's back in the day, and my friend had suggested that he hire me too. So eventually, from our relationship of me selling him shoes and telling him what's hot and what's not, he hired me to work in his importing company. So about 2 months after I was hired, I went to Asia. I had my 23rd birthday in Asia.
Wow. So you've now moved to Asia. Where are you at?
Well, I traveled a little bit in Asia, and eventually we started a brand called Airwalk.
Cool.
And so they planted me in Korea and had me doing, chief cook and bottle washer, doing all aspects of the product development, production, samples, anything and everything. I mean, worked on the first samples, brought them to the States. Even worked on some of the design projects for them. It was a really a crazy because it was a brand new business and it was very successful at the beginning. So I even went to probably 7 trade shows in 6 weeks and
Wow.
and visited tons of customers all over the country, collecting the orders on a spreadsheet. And at the very beginning, probably when I was 24 or 25, and then basically from then on, I was kind of working from Korea and spending a lot of time on the product development and production.
So did you have any, was there, at the time, was there any formal education for, because you talked about doing some night school for a potential other route, but was there any other formal education for design or development, or were you just learning on the job and from your experience in sales?
One of the guys who was hired to work with me, probably in my 3rd or 4th year at that company, was a graduate of our Sartoria School of Shoe Design.
Uh-huh.
And so there was, and I have friends and still have friends who are in the shoe design, came from that shoe design world. So yeah, it's fantastic, and it's a great education for, kind of the whole shoemaking process. So I had none, and basically learned just boots on the ground, kind of by being exposed to it.
Yeah.
I don't know of any other schools at that time. I doubt that there were. I mean, this is 1985, so not much in the way. I mean, Nike wasn't even big at that time, and Korea was the biggest shoe company, was an exporter, Mercury, and it was not it was still in its growth industry as far as basketball shoes or athletic shoes. So there was a lot of changes going on while I was there. And I was, of course, the oddball, being young and being a skateboarding guy around all the athletic people who were stationed in Korea. So I had a lot of friends in the industry, but, I wasn't invited to many Reebok or Nike parties.
Yeah. So I remember being young and, or I guess when I was younger, and Airwalk being super popular. I guess has it always been skate, or were you guys diving into any other categories within footwear?
After I left, so I was there for 5 or 6 years. After I left, they got into more, and while I was at the end of my tenure, they were starting making shoes out of Spain, and they were doing more casual shoes, and they were kind of, as skateboarding does, kind of ebbs and flows in popularity. So at that point, they were, of course, we had done a snowboard boot, and we had tried BMX type footwear, and then we started getting into more casual. That was very, pretty successful. After I left, I really don't know. I think they had some successes, but then their whole business model changed, and they started selling to bigger discounters, and that was kind of the beginning of the end for them as a brand.
I guess moving to Korea and being a part of like the initial launch, right, of Airwalk.
Yes.
Was there any nervousness that things weren't going to stick?
Well, I was so young, and there were only 3 or 4 of us who were working at the company at the beginning, and so there's no time to be nervous. There's nothing. I mean, failure. Well, we did so well at the very beginning, and got so many promises of orders. The question was, could we deliver on those orders? So there's a lot of pressure to make the shoes and get them produced. And so it was a baptism by fire. I mean, I really didn't have a lot of introspective time on my hands, let's just say.
For sure. No, that totally makes sense. That's cool that everything started off so hot. So you talked that you were into skate. Did you have any other passions that, or was skate kind of your thing?
Well, I got into skate simply because I was with that company. I was not a skateboarder. Um, I was a runner,
Okay.
and I did distance running. So that was my passion. Unfortunately, Korea at that time, the air was so bad and the traffic was so horrible. I mean, you were taking your life in your hands to go out and go run in Korea. Um, but um, I read a lot. I mean, I read a lot of books. I mean, I spent a lot of time in hotels. First
Yeah.
year I was there, I stayed at a hotel. The balance of my time, I had apartments there. Sometimes I shared with other people in the industry, but it's just not a lot of things to do in Korea. I mean, there was just not that many things to do. I made some friends with some kids in the neighborhood who were skateboarders, and they would come over on the weekends and hang out with me and our roommates, and I still actually keep in touch with them these days. They're
That's cool.
Yeah, but I mean, there's not a lot to do, so I read a lot of books.
That, yeah. Would you say then? So I guess before we move on to, I guess, your next venture, what, just like getting into it, was it the um, kind of initial work that you had while you were at Nordstrom's and maybe getting vetted out by the importer before things started with Airwalk?
Yeah,
Yeah. Where'd you go next? Where was?
the next stop for me was L.A. Gear. It was on the back end of L.A. Gear's. This is when they were going through their turmoil and had become a billion-dollar company, but their management system was so in crisis, and they had a lot of financial issues. I really don't know what those were particularly. I know from the Asian side, I heard a lot of crazy stories about what was going on over there, but I was not involved in it, and I was kind of basically running a buying and development team, and I had about 8 categories, and running and cross training and um, I don't know, tennis, and there were a bunch of other categories thrown in there. And I had a group of designers, and that was really the first time in my career that I've been responsible for all aspects, all the way through buying. I mean, at that company, we bought the product and followed the sales, sat through buying meetings, recommended buys, watched the product flow through the inventory, and had to keep inventories in mind. So it was a really fascinating experience, and we had moved back to the states, or I had moved back to the states, and it was a really a different experience going from. I remember meeting some kids on a boat one time on a trip, on a boat trip out into the San Diego Bay or something, and they were saying, "Oh, what do you do?" And they saw I was wearing Airwalks or something, and they said, "Oh, I said I work for." Did they ask me, "Do you work for Airwalks?" I said, "Yeah." "Oh, that's so cool. What are you doing now?" And I said, "Well, I work for LA Gear, 100 times bigger company." And
Yeah.
they said, "Oh, we're so sorry to hear that." So
So
it was.
they already knew that things were going down, or?
No. They just, to them, it's so uncool. LA Gear was so uncool, and Airwalk was a cool brand.
Oh,
So to them, that's cool that you work for Airwalk. Not considering, not the thought of whether it's a bigger company or a smaller company or something
right.
like that. I mean, Airwalk called me back a year and a half, 2 years later, and asked me if I would join back to the company. I said, "Well, you need to pay me, commensurate with what I'm making now." And they said, "Well, that's way too much money." I'm like, "Well, then that's what's going on. I have to think about my career." And again, I was being exposed to a whole new type of footwear, and lots of new categories. Although I had been experienced those when I was importing. Actually, we did lots of importing of kind of off-brand shoes for Mervyn's or Sears or different companies at that time. And so we were working with different kinds of footwear, but this was really, start to finish, a branded representation of product. So I began working at LA Gear on. Later, I was transferred to division to basically do what they call special makeups in the business, and they asked me to run that division, and basically that was like a buzzsaw. I mean, there was so much demand for old LA Gear shoes that I was bringing back tons of old LA Gear product and, taking it through marketing, taking it through the executives, but saying, I'd hold up a shoe and say 20,000 pairs. And they would go, oh, okay, go ahead and do that. Wow. We had a program that we did was over 1 million pair for a distributor in Mexico. And, there's just no way to argue with the fact that our business grew to about $100 million in old stuff. I mean, I was doing nothing really specific other than updating and making sure how to get it made and making sure how to, confirm the price, get the product ready, get a confirmation sample, get it signed off. Those types of running a business, and it was very, very successful, and a lot of demand. So at that time is probably the first time I started working with computer programming. I had a programmer with experience, Macintosh, Firefox, not Firefox, it was FileMaker, developer. He had experience in doing design of that program. So I started having him help me to develop kind of what I would say was my first experience in actually on a system where we'd link up to other computers via the internet and, link up Macs in Indonesia, link up a Mac in Taiwan, link up a Mac in Korea. That's the first time I'd ever heard or seen that. I mean, later in the later part of my career at LA Gear, they had brought in a multi-million-dollar, system that never worked and never was able to be implemented. But they spent hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars at the beginning. I don't know what it ended up. I ended up getting one of the boxes, this old Jurassic Park box, and using it as a coffee table. I put my coffee table on top of it, and it was a coffee table. This old, Anyway,
that's cool.
It was, yeah. So.
I guess did you realize at the time, like, so you talked about being on the boat with those kids, like now the footwear industry, at least job wise, seems to be in such high demand, and there seems to be a lot of people really trying to get in. Was like, obviously you had that experience with those kids, but did you realize at the time, like, how, or I guess, was it considered like to be really cool to be working in the footwear industry?
No, and a lot of people still, I worked at Soul Technology. People didn't know what the brand was and didn't know what the brands of the brand was. I mean, when you work at Converse, people know what that is, and they really don't understand what your job is, and I don't expect that to be the case. I have a really close friend who's teaching footwear in Arizona at one of the big colleges, and I've talked to her many times about her what's going on with the class or the people who are joining, and it's exciting. I mean, I'm happy for the people who would like to be in this business, and I think but it's such a weird, strange industry. In my generation, which there was not a lot of people necessarily in my generation who joined. I was at the tail end of a very big Nike generation. The Trip Allens who I met and those type of people. My generation was not a very, I guess I would say that I know some people who are still in the industry, but also, there wasn't it wasn't the biggest growth area, I don't think. At least that's my impression of it. And certainly at no time did I try to put any numbers to any of these types of things, but it just seemed like a lot of people who I knew who were of my age group had a lot of trouble early on, and then later, because during the growth in the industry, there was a lot of expectations from the. I remember hearing of and actually sitting through a Converse meeting where the president or the VP of marketing or something said, "We're not going to hire anybody unless they have a degree from college." And all of us shoe guys were looking around going, "Well, what the hell are we doing here?"
Yeah.
Good luck finding somebody who has experience in footwear. Actually, one of those guys who I had working for me at Soltec is a shoe school teacher at Nike now.
Oh,
because I think they realized that there was not a lot of institutional knowledge of the business.
Right.
And I run a business right now, and I have for the last 12 years as an expert witness. A lot of people I go up against are, for example, a expert in or PhD in rubber technology or plastics, or a marketing PhD. Well, that's all well and good, but they don't know what the realities of the footwear industry are.
Right.
So it's very easy to have a discussion about a topic that they don't know what they're talking about, where they talk about how it should be, but that's not the way it is. So that's how my experience has gone.
Interesting. You transferred over from Airwalk to LA Gear. Did you know someone there beforehand, or how did you get that first job? Or
they had contacted me a bunch of times, and they had run into a situation where they hired somebody from a very famous family in the shoe industry, and he never showed up for work, or showed up only a few times and never showed up again. And so they urgently had me come and work with them. I didn't really know anybody there. I met a lot of people subsequently working at Airwalk who are still friends of mine today, who are kind of legends in the shoe industry, because what they did at the end of at the very beginning of my tenure at LA Gear was to switch over to kind of the Disney family ownership of Airwalk and try to remake the brand. That's when they brought in Mark Goldston and did all the things that they did with the brand to try to rename it. That's why I said I went back and redid all the old shoes, because they were trying to do new shoes, and people didn't know what the product was.
Yeah.
And didn't recognize the product as and to me, LA Gear was the number one footwear for waitresses in LA. That's what it was.
Yeah.
And if you tried to get away from that, if you tried to make a basketball shoe for inner city in New York, I don't think so.
It's interesting to hear, like, you going back to the, like, in the SMU or special makeup products. It's because if you look at the biggest companies now, and like Nike or Adidas, and that's what they're doing now, right? Going back to the Air Force One, going back to the Samba, and obviously they're innovating in new spaces, but I'm sure a large majority of their sales are coming from pulling
Absolutely.
back those earlier
Totally.
designs.
Yeah, I'm involved in cases like that fairly often, of protectionism of those designs of the brand. What I can say about it is, as a consumer, and I'm not a young consumer, but as a consumer, I know what the product is, and so I'm more gravitate more to the more understandable product. And I think even in today's world, a lot of those authenticity questions are not answered very well by the brands, and they try to sell the newest this or the newest that, and a lot of people are looking for a more authentic representation of the brand than some of those. I don't know how to describe it other than they're a little bit beyond where the marketplace is at this moment,
Right.
and there's a lot of that kind of authentic product that is very, very popular on the marketplace. And I mean, and every company I've worked with, there is a premium on that product because you don't have to reinvent it. You do the same things over and over again.
Yeah.
It's 90% sales are white, 10%, 20% are black, and you just keep a full size run in the warehouse all the time. And you keep it deep and you keep it, and you sell like crazy, and it lets you do those other market pushing exercises. But that's the bread and butter of any company, and if you don't have one, build one.
Right. So, from LA Gear, did you then go to Soltec, or?
No, I went to a small company because I kind of was burnt out on LA. We had the riots, we had the earthquake. My wife's bank she worked at was robbed 3 times at gunpoint in one month, and there were shootings, and LA was just too crazy. So we moved to a smaller company. And I took on a job doing sales and development. So I worked out of Massachusetts and traveled to the West Coast to do sales, and then on to Asia to do the product development. It was when we just had a baby after we moved, and so it was kind of, or we just got pregnant, let's say, right after we moved. So it was just too much, and I was offered the job at Converse, and then took the job there. They offered me a job basically to go overseas and run the overseas R&D, which was very exciting to me. Starting out a new family, it's a great way to, bank some money and live a good lifestyle and work hard. That's a very hard job to take on, but I was looking forward to it. So I accepted the job from the delivery room at the hospital. So
wow,
yeah, pretty exciting.
That's really exciting. So then, where did you go overseas for Converse? Back in Korea or
Based out of Taiwan.
Based out of Taiwan. Okay.
And I'd spent some time in Taiwan, but I'd never lived there, and it's it's a fantastic place. It was a good experience, and it went well. And then eventually they moved me back to, Converse couldn't. It was starting to have financial troubles, and I was part of the whole move to Asia of the All-Star vulcanized shoes. So I was part of that, but I really don't know. I wasn't there when things were starting to go bad with Converse, but I can just say that when I got back to the States, things were rough, and it was they put me in charge of several areas that didn't look like they were going to do well, which was making a shoemaking facility, a sample making facility on site. That didn't seem like that was going to make it, and just some other things that were going on at the headquarters, which it seemed very, very dicey. And unfortunately, by the end of my first year there, I was let go, and all of the staff around me and all of the people in my area were let go, which was pretty plain to see that was going to happen. And then right away I was hired by Soltec, and moved from New Hampshire to LA or to Irvine.
Were you excited to be back in the Southern California area?
Yeah, sure. When I left, it was 60 degrees below zero, and there was an announcement in the morning. And I never really lived in the snow before. I was not there for very long, but woke up and there was an announcement that you shouldn't be outside for more than a few minutes. I'm like, why am I living in a place where you can't go outside?
Right.
And the snow was, up over the front door of my house, and we were trying to move, everything, and it's a nightmare. So I was glad to get back to Southern California. That's probably 2000, 2001, and started a long run at Soltech. I was there for 11 years.
That's awesome. So for anyone that doesn't know, I guess what were the brands that were under Soltech?
32 is a snowboarding boot brand. S, America, Etnies was the big brand. And the clothing brand Altamont. So that's basically. We also had some off stuff that Pierre had us do that was more fashion and frankly more dress type shoes, but that was our bread and butter skateboard brands.
Yeah. What was the process of, like, you talked about like when you were at Airwalk, LA Gear found you, then you moved to the smaller brand and then to Converse. Like, how did these companies find you? Were you connecting within like similar factories, or was it just like trade shows, different things like that? What was
most of it is through friends, sometimes with headhunters who would facilitate it. But once a headhunter knew friends of mine at a company, he would contact them and get internal support. And then one time I was overseas and I ran into a friend of mine and he said, come to work for me, or with me.
That's cool.
So I mean, it's really, today's world is much, much different, and there are a couple brands at one time that I thought I would target once I left Soltech to just see about, because I thought they were intriguing brands.
Yeah.
And I put in my resume, and I just wonder what, how that process worked. And it didn't seem like, the old days where I would get a stack of resumes and go through them one by one and then make phone calls to those people. And, I just didn't get the feeling that was happening in today's world.
Yeah.
There was no follow-up, there was no calls, there's no, here's what we're thinking. People reached out to me in the industry and asked me about coming to work for them, and I'd have a phone interview or something like that, and then I would I'd never hear a thing again.
Yeah.
And it was very strange to me. I always prided myself on at least letting somebody know, after I talked to them, that you're not going to get the job, or, we're just not interested at this time, or blah, blah, blah. But to get nothing, to mean radio silence, like we're so excited to talk to you again, we'll get back to you right away, and then never hear from them again. So I don't know what's going on in today's world, but it's very, very different than my experience in the hiring and firing arena.
Yeah, for sure. I think that sentiment is echoed throughout the industry.
I give you one more anecdote. And a friend of mine called me specifically. He said, "I have to. There's a company I'm working for. It's in your area, and we're gonna. I have to move. I have to leave. I'm thinking of you because you're nearby here. You'd be perfect for it. Let me put you in touch with the right people." I went up and interviewed with them, and nothing. I mean,
really.
So, that's my perfect example, because again, I was brought in, and I think in these days it seems like almost if you have a friend or if you know somebody, that kind of is not a positive thing.
Oh, interesting.
That's at least my concern. Or I'm sure it's different from a design perspective, but from other perspectives, I think it's harder.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough. It's kind of a weird time to get a job.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like.
Yeah.
So how long were you at Soltech? And is that then did you transition to being an expert witness?
Yeah, so I left Soltech. By the way, we had built a very successful product development um, computer system
Hmm.
for monitoring all forms of the product, and very successful. We were doing all of our work basically was done through the system, and all of our compatriots at the factories and at the at the at our offices overseas were all done through a program, and it was very successful. So I thought maybe there's a chance that after I left Soltech that I would do that more. I ended up doing some of that. I worked with Quicksilver
Okay.
on a big project. Um,
You've
they
been through
have
most of
already,
the big skate brands.
yeah, I actually was DC, the big skate brand,
Yeah.
was already using the software.
Okay.
So, but their other side, so in a totally separate bunch of buildings, was Quicksilver, Roxy, and the other brands. And so I was kind of brought in to work with them on their clothing, which I was not that experienced with, which was a great experience for me. I went through all of the learning about all of the processes that I was not that familiar with in the clothing side. So, working through the development of screens for for interfaces and how the process worked together in different teams. So it was a great experience, and eventually that I moved on from that experience and did some work with a men's suit manufacturer out of Chicago.
Wow.
So that was extremely interesting and totally different type of business and totally different type of company. They've been around for 80 years or something like that. It was very, very and very high quality products made in the United States and in Italy, and that was a great experience as well. But at the same time, I was also doing consulting. I hung up my shingle once I had left Soul Technology, and I've been doing all different types of projects for working with companies who would come to me with we just patented this. Can you help us to get a sample so that we can take it to Under Armour or somebody like that? And I did a bunch of those projects. Also work with a company who had developed a brand out of Mexico that were having serious quality problems, and basically had to help them re-engineer the product. And that was good to work out of Mexico again. It had been a while since I had been working there, so it was fun to do that. But I've done lots of different types of projects, and lots, anywhere from consulting on building a testing facility in China to, working for a Chinese company and working for U.S. companies, and lots of different types of experiences. And recently, in the very early portion, I did an expert witness case. Hadn't done anything for a little while. Then all of a sudden, I started getting a bunch of expert witness cases, and So at the beginning, it was basically the computer and the kind of product development stuff, 90%, 10%. Then it flipped about 6 years ago. Now it's about 90% expert witness and 10% other types of research or advice, counseling, whatever. So it's a totally different story, and I've doubled my hourly rate since when I started, and it's become pretty lucrative, and it's also it gives you time to I don't have to work every single day.
For sure. I guess explain a little bit like what it as an expert witness. I guess in my I guess I have a couple ideas, but could you explain a little bit of what that looks like? Or
it's weird. A lot of companies will come to me and say all different kinds of things. So the first thing you think is, well, you must have a lot of personal injury cases. I have almost zero. I mean, I've done probably 2 or 3 over the 12 years. I have turned away quite a few. I don't want to do that kind of work. I love the patent work. So I worked on a patent issue that had been going on for 30 or 40 years with a patent that was done by a Canadian company. The company was bought by Nike, then bought by another company, and it's an ongoing, fight over a particular patent issue, a very technical patent issue. And that was a fascinating. I actually went to court in Canada where they wear robes and wigs and the whole 9 yards. So that was a trip. Yeah. So I love I do a lot of trademark, a lot of design patent work. In other words, somebody will come to me and say, I'm being sued by a company who's saying that I've copied their design patent, design patents are not really the strongest tool in the industry, and patent work. And so there's so many different iterations of what I do. Sometimes a lot of it is research. Mm-hmm. Sometimes almost no research and just opinion, strictly opinion. Just working on a case that I'm getting ready to go to a verbal deposition where I wrote 2 depositions, total of 90 some pages, which, is not all of me just sitting down writing it, but working with lawyers to put in legalese and all that kind of stuff to make it a more legal document. But it's a lot of writing, a lot of reading. But again, I find it fascinating, and I also find the dynamics of a lot of these are very personal. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times, like, I sue you because I hate your guts, and I am jealous of you, or I think you've wronged me in some way, or I just don't like you, and so I go out and sue you. And a lot of these cases are so flimsy and so bad, but and I personally think I'm reading through and seeing the animosity, the anger in some of these lawsuits, which when you get up into the billion-dollar companies getting angry at each other, it's even more hilarious because the money that they throw at this, seems like their one-upsmanship of each other is quite astonishing.
Wow, that's really interesting. Did someone initially ask you to be an expert witness in a case, and that's what kind of led you into the field, or?
So, old boss of mine, who's very famous, Ned Fredericks, who's a very famous biomechanist, one of the first biomechanists to work for Nike. He was the guy who measured the heights of the jumps and how many jumps they did during a basketball game, that kind of thing. Yeah. Built one of the first testing labs, biomechanics labs for sports that Nike was famous for. He suggested he was phasing out of the expert witness business and didn't want to take on as many cases, so he referred some of my earliest cases to me. Not that many, but a few. And again, it's like anything, people hear about you, or they look up expert witness online. There are not that many. Yeah. So if you have as you build a resume, unfortunately, like this business is, you have to build the resume. And it was at first, it was a convincing job to tell people I did have the experience that they wanted to, be convincing. But I think my reputation has built itself over the years, and I am never one for very long. I don't do any advertising. I don't do any online marketing or promotion or anything else. It's all by word of mouth, all my business.
Huh, that's really cool. You're the first expert witness I've ever met in the footwear space.
Yeah, I mean, there's not many, and I know most of them, and I mean, who are really shoe people. I mean, there's a lot of people who do the expert witness. So, for example, I was at a big, huge case, and they'd flown in all these people from all over the country, all these lawyers from Chicago and New York and blah, 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 and they're doing these massive depositions, and they have the Nike guy who's a biomechanist who runs a biomechanist. He's probably very famous, and I know who he is, but he's not a shoe guy. So they ask him a question about shoes, and he says, I don't know anything about that. You'd have to ask Lenny. He knows a lot more about it than I do, and blew up their case. But that's what I think a lot of these companies have in their mind. Well, I'm a big shot, so I'm going to go out and hire a PhD. Mm-hmm. And that is, that information is not really applicable to what happens in the industry.
Yeah.
And is not applicable to what happens on the ground in factories. So, I mean, I think those are the easier cases, is when they have somebody who's got, some shoe experience, that it's a little bit more challenging because they have either a lot of knowledge or they have just enough information to make them dangerous, or, more likely the latter than the former.
Are there, when you get called on a case, or even any past cases, is it something that you can talk about, or is it all under legal guard or anything like that?
Well, all of the cases are listed on my website.
Oh, cool.
Except for one, which is something I can't talk about at all. And all of them are probably, if you looked them up online, if you look up Converse and LA Gear, I worked on a lot of those patent infringement, trademark issues, for example. I mean, I worked on a lot of those, and a lot of those are talked about in the press, and you can even go online and see depositions of mine and written depositions and that kind of thing. So none of it is necessarily secret. I'm not really supposed to talk about those types of things, though.
Okay. Can I share a link to your website with
Sure.
with this podcast? Okay, cool. So if you're watching and interested, I want to dive into it, and I think that's cool.
So I have two websites. lmhfootwearconsulting.com is where that's kind of the professional website, and then there's lennyholden.com, which is kind of a biographical website.
Okay, cool. I want to put them both on. That's really interesting. I think that's a different part of the industry than I've even considered. So that's really cool. And so you said 10% of your work is still on the development side.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming that's word of mouth too, or friends and connections that you've made.
Yes.
That's awesome.
And I get a lot of requests for work that I pass to Wade.
Right.
For example, of people who are starting new businesses, and who are looking for somebody to help them. That's not my work. I don't specialize. Wade specialized that, and also his partner, who is Dave Collins, another guy I think you're going to interview. He's that's his specialty. That's what they do specifically, is work with those types of customers.
Right. I guess being between, having just an awesome career and being between a lot of big companies at peaks or valleys or different times in their trajectory. What would you say? I guess for yourself and even for the companies. We can make it a two-part question, but we can talk about you first. Can you think of what brought about your success and ability to be a part of these big brands, and build kind of the resume that you have?
Well, I think specifically as it relates to me personally, I'm a very driven and meticulous person who's meticulous from the standpoint that follow the steps of what is going to make you successful, and not spend a lot of time on things that are, useless and are not going to work. And what I can say from a company standpoint is it is very hard to go from 100 million to 300 million, but to go from 300 million to 500 million, 600, 700, is quite easy, because what it means is that you've passed that point where people don't know about your shoes in this area, right?
Yeah.
People start to know about your product, and if it's good and people are excited about it and they see it a lot more people, that number can grow exponentially very, very quickly, and you can, your business can double, triple overnight. So that's what I have seen is kind of the facts. So what that means is that you want to deliver more than you don't deliver, and you want to deliver your best product. And sometimes it means that you have to say, this looks like something fun to do, but I gotta do the things that are going to turn the lights on and get the doors open and make sure that we can make that other crap later.
Totally.
Yeah, that's the biggest difference between like a small company and a big company. And there are bad people in small companies. There are bad people in big companies. There's a lot more. Obviously, the bigger, the more politics that you have. I mean, I have stayed away from, and I would stay away from a company like Nike or Reebok or Adidas. I mean, that kind of politics is just antithetical to what I've always said is that I don't want to be in charge of everything that starts with the letter Z. I don't want to be. I have friends who worked at Nike who said they would do their work in the morning, put all their work in their drawer, go have lunch, come back, take all the work out that they did in the morning, and just look at it again for a few hours till they got off work. I don't want to do that. And also another thing that a famous Nike guy told me was Nike always fires the best people first. So the more successful you are, the more hard charger that you are, the more aggressive that you are in your ability to succeed. And then to succeed puts more of a target on your back, and people want you out of the way. Want you. I remember going to interview at Reebok, and I was walking through the R&D development area, and they're moving chairs around and people are moving offices, and I'm like, oh wow, do you have a big change? He said, no, this is normal. Huh. And I said, oh Jesus, I wonder if I really want to get this job.
Yeah, you don't want to be a part of that, right?
No, it's a nightmare. I mean, it's just it's a revolving door, and people are always fighting for scraps, and I like to have some control over my own destiny, and that's what I would. I don't think I would work for another company again unless I had a role where I had basically total authority.
Right. Yeah, I like the. I think there are a lot of benefits to being at a smaller brand, a smaller company.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
I don't know. I think that it's just more fun for me as well. So I think that's interesting to hear your advice there. I guess there a lot of people listening to this are probably looking at ways to break into the industry or to be a part of them, and maybe it's the smaller or larger brands. Do you have any advice there on getting like that the first shot where it was from Nordstrom's to Airwalk is for someone now?
I really don't know. I mean, there are some really good companies out there who I think have very good product, but I see that they're controlled by kind of old school folks who run a very strange ship. So I don't know what to say about that kind of thing. I don't know where to if my sons had decided to, and I had an opportunity to have them work for me, that would be the way I would suggest to work with somebody who give you a chance.
Yeah.
They did work for me at Soltech when they were younger, and they enjoyed what they were doing, and they had a good time doing it. But if you try to get into the business today, I don't really know if you have to start at the very, very, very bottom and kind of work your way up. And let's say if you wanted to go work for, there's a company out of Santa Barbara, and if you want to go work for them, you'd have to go work in Santa Barbara. And they're a conglomerate company. They have lots of brands. They have some really good products. But you'd have to move to Santa Barbara. And I always wondered to myself, how is somebody who's got, who's going to make very little money, as starting out, going to live there? I mean, in Santa Barbara, it's, crazy how much it costs for, to rent. So, I mean, I don't know how you would even get started with a company like that. And there are so few that I would think, I don't know. It's a difficult question.
No, for sure. And yeah, that is it's a good point. I mean, it's depending on where you're going to live, the wages, the salary that you're going to get paid, like the actual ability just to make that work,
Yeah, it's tough.
It's tough for sure.
If you're going to live in New York City and work at a fashion brand, I mean, I was working with a women's fashion multi-brand house, and it was tough. The people who I got to know there, I mean, it was tough for them. They had to live with their families. They had to, make long treks. They had to, just is not a simple. It's a very complicated problem to have for somebody who's got to go through that stage of their career.
Yep. Yeah, something to figure out for sure, and maybe, who knows? And maybe it looks like entry level jobs overseas as well, or different opportunities. To get into it, but I guess, Lenny, I think your career has been really interesting. You've had a lot of cool jumps between companies, and now working in a completely different sector of the industry than I've ever even considered. I guess, do you have any other closing advice or I guess highlights or thoughts on your career, or anyone within the footwear space?
Making something is very difficult to do, and having ideas about doing something are very easy to do. There used to be a show in San Diego, I think it still goes on, the Action Sports Show, and in the 80s, 90s, I should say the 90s, I'd go to that show and I'd say, there's probably 10% of the people here who are actually going to make something. Yeah. And the other 90% are lucky if they'll be here next show. It's a difficult business to be in, and I mean, the best thing to do, I think, for somebody starting out is to work your way up and to learn as much as you can on the way up. Make yourself more valuable to a company.
Totally. I totally agree. Okay, well, I'm going to share the links to your two websites. I'm going to dive in. Maybe I'll reach back out to you with any questions about things that
feel free.
That you've
Absolutely.
worked on. But I really appreciate your time. I think this is going to be really interesting for people to, I guess, learning through your career and kind of different things that you're working on now.
Yeah, my pleasure.
But I really appreciate it. We can stay on the call. I'll just stop the recording. But
okay.
For anyone listening, thanks for listening, and leave any comments, and we can send them back to Lenny. But until next time.